for joining us today for this episode of Aerial Views. And I'm really happy to have Chris Norsworthy from NATS with us. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Maybe you could first tell our viewers a little bit about your role and your organization.
No problem at all. My name is Chris Norsworthy. I am Director of Airspace and Future Operations for NATS. So I oversee our contribution to the Airspace Change Programme and also our operationally change across systems and tools for our controlling and support community. And NATS is the main ANSP in the UK.
Now, I understand NATS is working on a large project which is called West Airspace Deployment. Maybe you can explain what that actually is and why it's important.
Certainly, absolutely. West Airspace Deployment is a really significant airspace change for us over the southwest of England and Wales. We've got an airspace modernisation strategy of government policy in the UK, all about the move towards aviation net zero and overhauling what is quite an out-of-date sort of infrastructure at the moment. This significant airspace change, so above 7,000 feet, between 7,000 feet and about flight level 245, 24,500 feet, this is going to systemize our airspace, which is going to make efficient use of performance-based navigation, and it's going to reduce workload for aircrew and our controllers in that airspace, bringing workload efficiency, safety resilience, capacity improvements in there. We deliver a high level of service today, but it comes at quite a high intervention rate. It takes a lot of tactical effort to achieve that. This type of systemization, use of these structures is intended to reduce that workload down, maintain that level of efficiency and reduce the effort it takes to provide it. Above 24,500 feet in the upper air, we'll be deploying free route airspace, the second deployment in the UK, following a successful deployment that we made in Scottish airspace. And free route airspace, common with many of our partners around the world, is about allowing aircraft to file their preferred trajectory and their preferred route between sort of fixed entry and exit points, so a lot more freedom. So it's a real significant airspace change for us because it really is our future strategy writ large. We want to systemize the lower airspace network where we need to, reduce that workload, where we've got quite a lot of mixing traffic, things still climbing and descending in and out of airfields. And then the upper air, its free route is our overall structure to allow the main environmental efficiency of people to fly where they wish.
Wow, there's a lot going on there. So you mentioned that NATS wanted to update their systems. Maybe you can go into a little more detail of what it was that prompted you to do this and what were the key things that you wanted to achieve, key challenges you wanted to solve.
Certainly. So the airspace itself is quite difficult to change. It's old structures sort of built in that post-war sort of environment, really using sort of ground aids. So that's led to a number of sort of constraints and pinch points that people are familiar with. As technology's moved on now, we've got more freedom and we can rely on technology and equipment in the aircraft much more. And that means we've got a lot more freedom for efficiency to be driven into our airspace structures. As I said, at the moment, we provide a really high level of service, but there's a lot of intervention, and that requires, obviously, either radio instructions backwards and forwards to the cockpit or use of data link and CPDLC instructions backwards and forwards. We really want to get into that realm where we've got a more reflective route network that's overhauled and a lot more modern, that's reflecting the current preferred routes and where we know aircraft sort of need to fly, and to reduce bunching. It's a bit like traffic jams, obviously, when you're on your way to the supermarket. If everyone's trying to go to the same place at the same time, or you arrive there at rush hour, you know you're going to be sort of stuck. If you've got parallel routes and you can expand the roadwork a little bit that people are familiar with, things tend to flow a lot more freely, and that's what we're trying to achieve over the airspace. It's a key part of our move towards aviation net zero. We're looking for significant sort of environmental savings that passes on as fuel savings to customers, reduced journey times, and those elements here. Of the West in particular, we're talking about 12,000 tonnes of CO2 every year to come from this deployment. Really significant saving. That's the equivalent of about 43 million miles in your average sort of petrol-driven car that's going to come that way. So there's really significant environmental benefit that we get there. Also, from our perspective, that reduction in workload is important for us because it allows us to improve capacity and increase capacity where we need to. Because if we're taking less instruction and less effort to move that number of flights through, obviously that opens up options for us in the future about how we would want to use those things.
So those are some pretty large numbers you quoted. So I'm just curious, is that per year or what's the time frame on
Yeah,
that?
that's per annum. So that's per year that we would normally measure those metrics in. So
Okay.
our
Yeah.
CO2 savings, and that reflects also what we saw enabled in our Scottish free route deployment as well. So significant numbers around that around those figures.
So how long has this actually taken since you actually came up with the idea to implement these changes to the airspace, to build the plan, to make the changes? How long has the path been to where you're at now?
Well, we're sort of constantly passing the baton on these types of evolutionary projects. West, in and of itself, we'd probably talk about a 5-year span. We'd sort of begun this back in sort of 2018 or so, tied to work that was ongoing. We try to coordinate this really carefully with stakeholders. Obviously, we're working with airports and partnering ANSPs and others all the time. I'm sure everyone's heard enough of it, but a significant event of COVID in the middle as well, about trying slightly reframing how we were going about some of these deployments and working to make some of these changes. And then a refresh about sort of 3 years ago in 2020 to reframe and tie this systemization up with the free route deployment that we're going to see arrive in March. So that period, around about 5 years in total over that footprint. Principles obviously around as we evolve through airspace change for longer, and about 3 years in its real current form about where it's operating.
So I'm just curious, since you mentioned COVID, although everyone is kind of tired of this topic, but I'm going to ask, since you mentioned it, a lot of companies have said that the reduction in air traffic actually allowed them to accelerate projects like this because they had the time to focus on things other than managing traffic. Did you find that outcome also?
It was really difficult. I don't think it's quite that clear cut in this case. I think because of the expertise that we need and the staff that we share operationally and non-operationally, there were certainly opportunities in there. So there were certainly bits of headroom that we were able to find, but we were really focused on operational resilience and recovery. Obviously, the health and safety drove quite a lot of criteria about how closely people could be working together and those aspects. So I don't think in and of itself for this particular project we'd say, as a result, we've saved a year. We certainly, for the environmental and the route assessments, we do some other work around smaller scale airspace deployments around the edges that we make procedural changes on. Things like that we were able to give a bit more headroom and look at more cleanly. But I think it really was reframing timeframes, our ability to deploy and get through. So we're pleased to be able to be looking at the deployment in March next month.
Okay. And so speaking of the March deployment, I understand that the 23rd is the big day. So what do you still have left to do between now and then?
Yeah, well, we're in the main thing is we're in the final stages of what we call OCT, the operational conversion training, which takes place before any major deployment, and teams will be working hard to achieve that. The total impact of our controlling community is sort of getting close to 600 people by the time you've got your core controllers, the ancillary sectors impacted, procedure changes and other briefings to give. So that's a really significant undertaking, as everyone will know across the industry, and we maintain the service effectively that we're running at the moment, and then we take those people in and out and get ready for a deployment. So I think these phases is a bit like, again, to use another road analogy, is a bit like your motorway or a freeway where the operation is going to keep running. We need to keep delivering a service, and we get everybody up to speed on a slip road, and then we slot in on March the 23rd, hopefully, pain-free and with good experience, and then we start to reap the benefits that we're talking about here. So, 12 kilotons of CO2 a year is really significant. It's going to reduce flying distance, again, in that per annum basis, take about 150,000 nautical miles of flying distance out every year, and flying time of over 800 hours as well as that CO2 saving. So getting everyone to continue to deliver the service we need today, train up to get ready for March the 23rd through those AIRAC and those procedure changes in the cockpit, the significant procedure changes that our supporting teams will be ready to make. Hopefully we're in for another sort of successful transition to move on.
So just one last question from my side. How does UTM come into play in the changes you're making?
I think it's really interesting because part of that AMS and our whole airspace strategy is pointing towards more integration. It's all about integrating sort of new users, but without destabilizing and impacting your existing user base and your existing airspace users. Okay, so I look at the systemization aspect of this really clearly as one of the first enabling and critical steps for this. When I talk about a tactical environment, we've obviously got blocks of what we would call controlled airspace, so that ring-fenced airspace where our commercial aircraft are typically operating. And at the moment, in a tactical environment, you broadly know what's going on, but you've obviously got a lot of variation in there with tactical intervention and headings that we would use and vector paths, etc., etc. Getting more systemization into that network, I think, is a really key step for the first stage of getting ready for the phases of integration, because you're creating that much more known environment. And once you've started to narrow that down and got much clearer, and you've started to see, well, okay, we think we're going to be on these rails, we'll look at this and look at the reduction in vectoring tracks and pathways. It will take time for that to bed in and evolve properly. But once you've done that, you've got options about shrinking your controlled airspace footprint to enable that integration in outside or in Class G or in other classes of airspace, in C or G elsewhere. Or alternatively, you can start to free up paths within that airspace to say, well, okay, we know we've got this established systemized structure now, and we've got options and areas to much more cleanly integrate. It's hard to integrate into an unknown environment. The point of this systemization is to create that known environment, get rid of some of the hostility, and actually make it easier for these first phases to sort of start integration and start working in harmony together.
Sounds good. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. I wish you the best of luck in making the 23rd date. It sounds like you're well on track for that, and look forward to speaking again.
Thank you very much indeed for your time. Thank you.